If you still believe humans are harmless because we smile before we speak, then you have already made the same mistake that nearly rewrote the history of this galaxy. Those were the first words Dr. Mason Brooks spoke after the Galactic Xenobiology Council voted unanimously to classify humanity as an evolved herbivore species. Nobody applauded. Nobody laughed. In fact, nobody even looked at him. They were too busy congratulating one another on what they proudly called the most complete biological survey ever assembled. The council chamber floated high above the capital world of Aster Prime, wrapped in transparent crystal walls that revealed an endless sea of stars. Representatives from more than 200 civilizations filled the circular hall, each surrounded by holographic displays showing charts, skeletal models, dietary analyses, and centuries of collected observations. According to the data, humans cultivated crops on nearly every continent, domesticated countless animal species instead of hunting them into extinction, built hospitals before fortresses, negotiated treaties instead of launching invasions, and donated food to strangers they had never met. Every graph pointed toward the same conclusion: peaceful, cooperative, herbivorous by evolutionary behavior. High biologist Thalen adjusted his silver robes and smiled with quiet satisfaction. Humanity has demonstrated remarkable restraint for a species of its developmental age. Their conflict rates continue to decline, their nutritional diversity reflects agricultural dependence, and their social structures prioritize cooperation over predation. The classification is appropriate. Around the chamber, glowing approval lights flickered one after another. The vote was over almost before it began. Dr. Mason Brooks sat alone behind the small Earth delegation desk, wearing a plain navy suit that looked almost out of place among the elaborate ceremonial uniforms surrounding him. At 58 years old, with weathered hands, gray at his temples, and reading glasses resting low on his nose, he looked more like a community college professor than the chief xenobiologist of Earth. His assistant, Olivia Grant, leaned closer and whispered, "Are you really not going to challenge this?" Mason quietly closed the folder in front of him. "No," Olivia blinked. "But they're wrong." He nodded once. "Yes." "Then why let them vote?" Mason looked through the transparent wall at the distant blue star that marked humanity's home system. His expression never changed. Because facts rarely change minds. Olivia frowned. "So what does?" Mason finally reached into his leather notebook and uncapped an old fountain pen. On an otherwise blank page, he wrote a single sentence with slow, deliberate strokes. "You forgot to ask why we have canine teeth." He closed the notebook before anyone else could read it. Across the chamber, another speaker continued presenting colorful charts comparing human eating habits with dozens of peaceful herbivorous species. The audience nodded along, completely convinced by statistics that seemed impossible to dispute. Not one of them asked why the human jaw had evolved the way it had. Not one of them questioned why endurance mattered more than speed. Not one of them wondered why a species capable of extraordinary kindness also carried instincts that had once allowed it to survive ice ages, famine, and predators far larger than itself. They had mistaken civilization for biology. They had confused self-control with incapability. As the final approval lights illuminated the ceiling, high biologist Thalen smiled toward Mason with genuine warmth. "Congratulations, Dr. Brooks. Humanity should take pride in joining the galaxy as one of its most peaceful herbivorous civilizations." Mason stood, buttoned his jacket, and returned a polite smile. "Thank you," he said calmly. "I only hope your students never have to discover the difference between choosing not to bite and not having teeth." The chamber grew strangely quiet, but only for a moment. Then the conversations resumed, the report was archived, and the council moved on to the next item, completely unaware that history had just recorded one of the most expensive scientific mistakes ever made. The shuttle touched down in western Montana just after sunrise, its landing struts settling onto a quiet airfield surrounded by rolling green hills and snow still clinging to the distant mountain peaks. The visitors stepped outside expecting to find evidence that would confirm everything they believed about humanity. Dr. Mason Brooks walked several feet ahead with his hands tucked inside the pockets of his light brown jacket, breathing in the crisp morning air as though he had returned home after a long business trip. Behind him followed high biologist Thalen, 3 senior researchers from the Galactic Xenobiology Council, and a dozen junior observers carrying scanners that recorded everything from pollen density to heart rate fluctuations. One young researcher tilted his head toward the nearby pasture where several children chased a golden retriever across an open field. "They allow their offspring to play beside another predator?" he asked. Mason smiled without slowing his pace. "That is Cooper. He is 10 years old and mostly interested in tennis balls." The researchers quietly recorded another observation: cooperative relationship with carnivorous domestic species. Further evidence supporting herbivore behavior. Olivia Grant glanced sideways at Mason. "You are really going to let them keep writing that?" Mason shrugged. "Watch first." They drove 20 miles into the small town of Pine Ridge, where American flags hung from front porches, pickup trucks lined Main Street, and the smell of smoked barbecue drifted from a family-owned restaurant preparing for the lunch crowd. The alien visitors watched neighbors wave at complete strangers, teenagers help an elderly woman carry groceries across the parking lot, and a volunteer firefighter stopped to fix a little girl's bicycle chain before continuing on his way. Everywhere they looked, they found cooperation instead of competition, kindness instead of intimidation. At the local elementary school, Principal Rebecca Collins welcomed the delegation with homemade cookies waiting in the front office. "We are glad you came," she said warmly. "The kids have been excited all week." Phelan accepted one of the cookies, carefully scanned it, then took a cautious bite. His eyes widened slightly. "Pleasant." Olivia hid a smile. Soon the visitors stood outside watching recess as children laughed across the playground. One researcher quietly commented, "Notice how the young avoid physical confrontation. Disagreements are resolved verbally. This species consistently discourages aggressive instincts." Another nodded while updating his report. "Social reinforcement favors cooperation over dominance." Mason remained silent. A school bell rang, and the children lined up without anyone shouting orders. The researchers seemed genuinely impressed. Later that afternoon, they visited a family-owned cattle ranch outside town. Rancher Daniel Carter greeted everyone with a firm handshake, worn blue jeans, dusty work boots, and the relaxed confidence of someone who had spent his entire life outdoors. His wife, Emily, offered fresh lemonade, while their 12-year-old daughter Lily proudly introduced every horse by name. One junior researcher whispered, "They raise large animals, but treat them almost like family." Phelan folded his hands behind his back with quiet satisfaction. "Exactly as expected. They nurture. They cultivate. They protect." Every observation strengthens the original classification. Daniel overheard the last sentence and chuckled politely. "Well, around here we just call it taking care of what depends on you." Phelan smiled. A noble philosophy. As the sun drifted lower across the Montana sky, the delegation gathered near a wooden fence overlooking miles of open pasture glowing gold beneath the evening light. The visitors believed they had seen everything necessary to confirm their conclusions. Peaceful neighborhoods, friendly conversations, families, farms, schools, shared meals. Every moment fit neatly inside the report they had already written before arriving. Olivia quietly stepped beside Mason as the others admired the landscape. "They think they understand us now." Mason watched Daniel Carter repairing a section of fence while Lily laughed beside her dog in the fading sunlight. "No," he answered softly. "They have only seen the parts of ourselves we hope the world never gives us a reason to leave behind." The following morning, the research team converted the Pine Ridge Community Center into a temporary biological field laboratory, and by 8 o'clock every table had disappeared beneath scanners, holographic skeletons, dental molds, nutrition reports, and evolutionary charts. Outside, families were beginning another ordinary day. School buses rolled down quiet streets. Farmers headed toward their fields. The smell of fresh coffee drifted in every time someone opened the front door. Inside, however, the atmosphere carried the excitement of scientists convinced they were about to publish a discovery that would reshape every biology textbook in the galaxy. High biologist Thalen stood beside a rotating three-dimensional model of the human skull. "Observe the jaw structure," he explained to the younger researchers. "The enlarged front teeth support processing plant material. Social cooperation reduced the necessity for predatory adaptation. These small pointed teeth are clearly evolutionary remnants." A young researcher named Lyra tilted her head. She was the youngest member of the expedition, barely into her second year as a xenobiologist, and unlike the others, she spent more time asking questions than celebrating conclusions. If they are remnants, she asked carefully, why are they still fully functional? Thalen answered without hesitation. Because evolution is rarely efficient. Vestigial structures often remain long after their original purpose disappears. Several researchers nodded while recording the explanation. Lyra remained unconvinced. She enlarged the dental model until every tooth floated separately above the display. The measurements bothered her. Human incisors sliced efficiently. Molars crushed multiple food types. The canines were not especially long compared to apex predators, but they were surprisingly durable. More importantly, they matched powerful jaw muscles that appeared stronger than necessary for a purely plant-based evolutionary history. She quietly walked toward Mason Brooks, who was reviewing agricultural reports near the window. Dr. Brooks, may I ask you something? Mason looked up from his notebook. Of course. Has humanity ever officially classified itself as herbivorous? Mason smiled gently. No. Then what are humans? He thought for a moment before answering. Hungry, usually. Lyra frowned. I am serious. So am I. She sighed. Everyone says your civilization values honesty. It does. Then why will nobody answer such a simple biological question? Mason looked through the window where Daniel Carter was unloading hay from the back of his truck, while Lily tossed a tennis ball for Cooper across the ranch yard. Because, Mason said quietly, you are asking for a definition when you should be asking for a history. Before Lyra could respond, another researcher called everyone back to the central table. New metabolic scans had arrived from Earth Medical Archives. They confirmed that humans processed vegetables, grains, fruit, dairy, seafood, and meat with remarkable efficiency. The room immediately filled with excited discussion. An omnivorous diet developed after civilization, one scientist suggested. Exactly, another replied. Dietary flexibility does not contradict herbivore ancestry. Thalen folded his hands confidently. Adaptation through agriculture explains everything. Lyra slowly shook her head. No, it explains convenience. It does not explain anatomy. Several researchers exchanged amused glances. One of them laughed softly. You are searching for predators where none exist. Mason quietly closed his notebook. He had heard enough. Without interrupting their debate, he walked toward the exit. Olivia caught up with him outside beneath the clear Montana sky. You are leaving? She asked. For a little while. Do you think they will figure it out? Mason glanced toward the mountains stretching across the western horizon. Not from inside that building. Olivia crossed her arms. Then what are they missing? Mason watched a hawk circle silently above the open fields while Cooper suddenly stopped chasing the tennis ball and stared toward the distant tree line. Even Daniel Carter noticed the dog's unusual behavior. Mason spoke so softly that only Olivia could hear him. They keep studying our mouths. He paused for a long moment before adding. The real answer has never been in our teeth. It has always been in the moment we decide whether to use them. The invitation arrived just before noon. It came from the Montana Wildlife Research Preserve, a protected valley about 30 miles outside Pine Ridge, where several native species lived with minimal human interference. The preserve director had learned about the Galactic Xenobiology Council's visit and offered a guided field demonstration on how humans interacted with large wildlife. High biologist Thalen accepted immediately. Excellent, he said while gathering his notes. Observing natural behavior outside civilization will strengthen our findings. Mason Brooks simply nodded. It will certainly answer a few questions. By early afternoon, 2 utility vehicles rolled through the preserve's entrance beneath a weathered wooden sign that read, Respect the Animals. They were here first. Ranger Sarah Mitchell greeted the group with an easy smile beneath the brim of her faded park hat. She had spent more than 20 years protecting wildlife across Montana, and it showed in the calm way she carried herself. Before we head out, she said, there is one rule everybody follows. Stay with your guide. If something unexpected happens, do not panic and do not run. One of the alien researchers looked puzzled. Your local species attack visitors? Sarah chuckled softly. Usually not. Most wild animals want nothing to do with people. Respect goes both ways. Thalen quietly recorded another note. Cooperative coexistence with native fauna. Further behavioral evidence supporting passive evolutionary tendencies. The convoy followed a gravel road that wound through forests of towering pine before opening into broad grasslands surrounded by distant mountains. Herds of elk grazed peacefully. Bald eagles circled high overhead. A small black bear wandered across a hillside before disappearing into the trees without acknowledging the vehicles at all. The visiting scientists were fascinated. Everywhere they looked, humans seemed content sharing space rather than dominating it. During a short stop near a scenic overlook, Lily Carter climbed out beside her father, Daniel, while Cooper bounded happily through the tall grass with his usual endless energy. Emily unpacked sandwiches from a cooler as everyone admired the view stretching for miles beneath a bright blue sky. Lyra stood beside Mason, still thinking about their earlier conversation. "Back at the laboratory," she said, "you told me I should study history instead of definitions." Mason looked across the valley where Daniel reminded Lily not to wander too far from the trail. "History explains why biology matters." "Then tell me one thing." Mason smiled. "Ask, if humans are not what the council believes." She hesitated. "Why spend so much energy convincing the galaxy that you are peaceful?" Mason answered without taking his eyes off the landscape. "Because peace takes effort. Violence does not." Before Lyra could ask another question, Cooper suddenly stopped chasing a stick. The golden retriever froze completely, his ears standing upright as he stared toward a patch of dense trees at the edge of the meadow. Daniel noticed immediately. His relaxed posture changed, not into panic, but into quiet attention. He calmly placed a hand on Lily's shoulder. "Sweetheart," he said in a steady voice, "come stand next to me for a minute." Lily looked confused. "Why?" "Just humor your old man." She walked over without arguing. Sarah Mitchell followed Cooper's gaze, and her expression became serious. She lifted one hand toward the group. Everyone stay together. Phelan glanced around the peaceful valley and seemed almost embarrassed by the precaution. "Surely this is unnecessary," he said. "Everything appears perfectly calm." Sarah never looked away from the tree line. "Out here," she replied quietly. "The calm part is usually what comes right before you find out whether you have been paying attention." For several long seconds, nothing happened. The meadow remained quiet except for the breeze rolling through the tall grass and the distant call of a hawk somewhere above the valley. Yet every experienced human in the group had already changed. Ranger Sarah Mitchell slowly stepped in front of the visitors without making a show of it. Daniel Carter rested one hand lightly on Lily's shoulder while keeping his eyes fixed on the tree line. Emily reached down and clipped Cooper's leash onto his collar, even though the dog had stopped moving on his own. No one shouted. No one panicked. The silence itself became a language. Phelan looked around with growing confusion. "I still do not understand," he said quietly. "What exactly are you expecting?" Sarah answered without taking her eyes off the trees. "Maybe nothing." "Then why prepare?" Daniel replied before she could. "Because hoping is not the same thing as knowing." One of the younger researchers activated a handheld scanner and swept it across the meadow. "I detect no immediate threat." Mason Brooks smiled faintly. "That is because your scanner is measuring movement." Lyra looked at him. "And what are you measuring?" Mason folded his arms. "Experience." Another minute passed before Cooper released a low, uneasy whine. It was the first sound the dog had made since freezing in place. Daniel immediately crouched beside Lily. "I need you to stay right next to Mom for a little while." Lily nodded without asking questions. She had clearly heard those words before. Phelan watched the exchange with fascination. Your child obeyed instantly. Emily smiled gently. She trusts her dad. Without explanation? Emily looked surprised by the question. Sometimes you do not need an explanation from someone who has spent your whole life keeping you safe. Lyra quietly recorded the sentence. It felt more important than the biological notes filling her tablet. Then the preserve radio crackled to life on Sarah's shoulder. Unit 4, be advised. Motion cameras picked up a large mountain lion moving south through your sector approximately 6 minutes ago. Maintain visual awareness. Sarah calmly acknowledged the message. Copy that. The alien delegation immediately looked toward the surrounding hills, but they still saw nothing. Phelan turned toward Mason. Surely your authorities will remove the animal. Sarah answered before Mason could. No, this is its home. We are the visitors. That response puzzled nearly everyone except Lyra. She looked back toward the forest, trying to understand a civilization that respected something powerful enough to command caution without immediately trying to eliminate it. Several minutes later, the radio sounded again. Update. The animal has changed direction and appears to be leaving your area. Sarah waited another full minute before finally relaxing her shoulders. All right, she said. Looks like it decided it had somewhere else to be. The atmosphere changed almost instantly. Daniel smiled at Lily. Cooper began wagging his tail again. Conversations resumed. Emily handed out sandwiches as though nothing unusual had happened. Phelan looked genuinely relieved. A fortunate outcome. Daniel nodded. Most of the time, yes. So there was never any real danger? Daniel looked at him for a moment before answering. There was no conflict because everyone respected the line that keeps one from happening. Mason glanced toward Lyra, who was still staring thoughtfully at the quiet tree line. She finally understood why every human had reacted before any scanner, alarm, or machine had detected a problem. Their first instinct had not been to fight. Their first instinct had been to protect. And for the first time since arriving on Earth, she began to wonder whether the Council had misunderstood not only human biology, but the very definition of strength. That evening, the delegation returned to the community center, but the mood inside the temporary laboratory had changed in ways that were difficult to measure with scanners or charts. The data collected throughout the day remained exactly the same, yet the conversations sounded different. The younger researchers no longer argued with complete certainty. Instead, they asked questions. Lyra stood before the holographic model of a human skeleton once again, this time comparing it with several known herbivorous species from across the galaxy. The similarities that had seemed obvious only yesterday now felt strangely incomplete. I think we started with the wrong question, she said quietly. Phelan looked up from his terminal. Explain. Lyra enlarged the image of the human jaw, then shifted to the shoulder joints, the spine, the hands, and finally the eyes. We have been asking what humans eat. She paused. We never asked what humans evolved to survive. The room fell silent. Mason Brooks looked over from the coffee machine, but said nothing. Another researcher pulled up endurance records collected from Earth's historical archives. This cannot be correct, he muttered. Ancient humans traveled dozens of miles on foot in a single day. Olivia Grant smiled into her coffee. Sometimes more. Another researcher added, their cardiovascular endurance exceeds many species classified as pursuit predators. Phelan frowned. That still does not make them predators. Mason finally joined the discussion, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee, one of which he quietly handed to Lyra. No, he agreed. It does not. Phelan looked relieved until Mason continued. It simply means you have been placing every species into only 2 boxes. He walked toward the central display and gently rotated the hologram until a pair of human hands filled the room. You see claws or hooves. We see hands. You see teeth. We see tools. You study one feature at a time. Human evolution never worked that way. Lyra studied the image more carefully. Strong thumbs. Flexible wrists. Forward-facing eyes. Dense leg muscles. Efficient lungs. Complex social behavior. None of those traits alone explained humanity. Together, however, they formed something entirely different. You are saying the individual traits are not the answer, she whispered. Mason nodded. Exactly. He picked up a wooden pencil lying beside a notebook and held it in front of the group. This is harmless. He set it down beside an engineering blueprint. In the hands of an architect, it becomes a building. Then he placed it beside a child's drawing. In the hands of a little girl, it becomes imagination. Finally, he slipped the pencil back into his pocket. The object never changed. The choice did. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Even Phelan seemed lost in thought. So your biology cannot be separated from your decisions, he finally said. Mason smiled. Now you are getting closer. Outside, the evening sun dipped behind the mountains as Pine Ridge settled into another peaceful night. Porch lights flickered on. Families gathered around dinner tables. Laughter drifted across quiet streets. It looked exactly like the peaceful civilization the Council had expected to find. Yet inside the laboratory, every assumption was beginning to unravel. Lyra closed her tablet and looked directly at Mason. If restraint is something humans choose, she asked softly, then what teaches an entire civilization to make that choice? Mason stared through the window at Daniel Carter, helping Lily stack firewood, while Cooper rested at their feet. His answer came almost as a whisper. History. Every generation remembers what happens when people forget that strength is supposed to protect first. No one entered another note into the official report that evening, but every person in the room understood that the final version would no longer be as simple as anyone had believed only 2 days earlier. The next morning, Mason Brooks asked the delegation to postpone every scheduled lecture and laboratory session. Instead, he led them into a quiet archive room inside the Pine Ridge Historical Museum, a place most tourists ignored in favor of hiking trails and scenic overlooks. The building smelled of old wood, paper, and fresh coffee. Framed photographs lined the walls. There were no advanced holograms, no quantum scanners, and no artificial intelligence presenting polished conclusions. Just the recorded memories of ordinary people. "You wanted to understand human biology," Mason said as he unlocked a glass display case. "You cannot do that without understanding human memory." Thalen folded his arms. "History is culture. We came here to study evolution." Mason carefully lifted an old pair of worn leatherwork gloves from the display. "On Earth, the two are connected." He handed the gloves to Lyra. "These belong to a volunteer firefighter who spent 30 years responding to emergencies in this county." Lyra examined the cracked leather. "Why preserve something so ordinary?" Mason smiled. "Because someone used them to help people they had never met." They continued through the museum. Every exhibit told a similar story. Farmers rebuilding after droughts. Neighbors clearing roads after winter storms. Nurses working through epidemics. Search and rescue teams hiking for hours to bring home hikers they had never known. None of the displays celebrated victory over an enemy. They celebrated responsibility toward one another. One researcher quietly whispered, "Your museum's honor service more than conquest." Mason nodded. "Most of us hope that says something worth remembering." They stopped in front of a faded black and white photograph showing exhausted workers sharing sandwiches after rebuilding a collapsed bridge nearly a century earlier. Thalen studied the faces. "Every one of them looks tired." Daniel Carter, who had joined the tour that morning, smiled. "That is because they were." "Then why are they smiling?" Daniel shrugged. "Because the bridge was open again." The simplicity of the answer lingered in the room. Lyra slowly began connecting pieces that had seemed unrelated only days before. Endurance, cooperation, adaptability, protective instincts. None of them existed to dominate. They existed to keep communities alive through difficult times. She turned toward Mason. "You keep saying humans choose restraint. Was that always true?" Mason looked at the old photographs for several quiet seconds before answering. "No." His voice was calm, but carried a weight the room had not heard before. "We have made terrible mistakes throughout our history. We have hurt one another. We have learned painful lessons. That is exactly why kindness became a choice instead of an accident." Nobody interrupted him. "Every generation teaches the next one that strength without compassion eventually destroys the people holding it. That lesson cost us more than any museum could ever display." Thalen lowered his tablet without realizing it. For the first time since arriving on Earth, he had stopped collecting evidence and simply listened. As the group prepared to leave, Lyra paused beside a display containing nothing more than a child's handwritten thank you card addressed to local rescue volunteers. She read it twice before quietly asking, "Is this really as important as your scientific records?" Mason smiled warmly. "More important." She looked surprised. "Why?" Mason opened the museum door, letting the cool Montana morning air drift inside. Outside, school children laughed as they crossed the street. Neighbors waved from passing pickup trucks, and life continued with the ordinary rhythm the visitors had almost overlooked. "Because," Mason said softly, "our greatest evolutionary advantage was never surviving the hardest days. It was learning how to become the kind of people who helped each other through them." 3 days later, the delegation returned to Astor Prime carrying thousands of pages of field notes, biological scans, historical records, and interviews collected across Montana. Yet the heaviest thing they brought home was doubt. The Grand Assembly Chamber looked exactly as it had before, its crystal ceiling stretching high above rows of delegates representing hundreds of civilizations. Reporters filled the observation balconies, expecting an uneventful scientific presentation that would officially celebrate the newest member of the galactic community as another peaceful herbivorous civilization. High biologist Thalen walked toward the central podium carrying the report he had personally approved before leaving Earth. He stopped halfway. Then, without saying a word, he removed the first page, folded it carefully, and set it aside. A quiet murmur spread through the chamber. One council member leaned toward another. Why is he changing the report? Phelan looked toward Lyra, who sat with the research team, then toward Mason Brooks, who remained seated at the Earth delegation table with the same calm expression he had worn since the beginning. Finally, Phelan spoke. Before this expedition, I believed we had answered the question of what humanity is. He paused. I now believe we answered the wrong question. The room became noticeably quieter. A massive holographic display appeared behind him. It did not show jaws, teeth, or dietary charts. Instead, photographs from Pine Ridge filled the chamber. Daniel Carter repairing a fence while his daughter laughed nearby. Emily handing lemonade to complete strangers. Volunteer firefighters covered in dust after helping neighbors. Schoolchildren collecting canned food for families they had never met. Rescue workers hiking through snow to reach someone in trouble. Ordinary people living ordinary lives. One delegate finally interrupted. These are cultural examples, not biological evidence. Lyra stood before Phelan could answer. Her voice was steady, though everyone could hear the excitement beneath it. That is exactly where we made our mistake. Every eye turned toward her. She activated another display comparing hundreds of anatomical measurements collected during the expedition. Human anatomy supports endurance, adaptability, tool use, cooperation, environmental flexibility, and controlled force. None of these traits independently define a herbivore or a predator. Together, they describe something far more unusual. Another council member frowned. Then what is humanity? Lyra looked toward Mason before answering. A species whose survival depends as much on conscious choice as biological instinct. Several delegates exchanged confused glances. One scientist objected. Biology cannot depend upon morality. Mason finally rose from his seat. He did not hurry to the podium. He simply stood where he was, speaking in the same calm voice everyone remembered from the original hearing. No, he said. Biology does not. The chamber fell completely silent. But civilization does. Nobody interrupted him. Mason continued. Your reports kept asking whether humans could be dangerous. That was never the important question. The important question is why most humans spend their entire lives trying not to become dangerous. Even the translation systems seemed to hesitate before repeating his words throughout the chamber. Phelan slowly opened the revised report. The original classification will be withdrawn. A soft wave of surprise moved across the assembly. The council's new conclusion is as follows. Humanity cannot be accurately classified by dietary assumptions or isolated anatomical features. Their defining characteristic is voluntary restraint supported by extraordinary adaptability, cooperative survival, and learned responsibility. He looked across the chamber before reading the final sentence. Our greatest scientific error was not misunderstanding the structure of the human body. It was misunderstanding the purpose behind its self-control. No applause followed. No celebration broke the silence. Across hundreds of seats, delegates simply sat in thoughtful stillness, realizing that an entire civilization had almost been misunderstood because they had mistaken kindness for weakness. After the assembly adjourned, the chamber remained unusually quiet. Delegates who normally hurried toward interviews or private negotiations lingered in small groups, speaking in hushed voices as they reread the revised report. For the first time in generations, the Galactic Xenobiology Council had publicly admitted that it had mistaken the character of an entire civilization. Mason Brooks packed his notebook into the same worn leather briefcase he had carried since arriving on Aster Prime. Olivia Grant smiled as she watched him close the clasps. That is it, she asked. No victory speech? Mason adjusted his jacket. The report was never about winning. Then what was it about? He looked around the nearly empty chamber. Understanding usually lasts longer than being right. As they walked toward the exit, Lyra hurried to catch up with them. She carried a freshly printed copy of the council's final classification. Dr. Brooks. Mason stopped. Yes. She hesitated before holding out the document. Would you sign this? Olivia laughed softly. You want the author? Lyra shook her head. No. I want the person who refused to embarrass us when he could have. Mason accepted the paper, smiled, and instead of signing across the title, wrote a single sentence in the margin. Never confuse restraint with inability. He handed it back without another word. Weeks later, The revised report became required reading in every major academy across the known galaxy. Students no longer memorized humanity as an example of peaceful herbivorous evolution. Instead, professors used Earth to teach a more difficult lesson. Intelligence without humility creates bad science. Observation without understanding creates dangerous assumptions. Far away on Earth, life in Pine Ridge continued exactly as it always had. Daniel Carter repaired another section of fence after a spring storm. Emily organized a fundraiser for a family whose house had been damaged by flooding. Lily walked home from school, with Cooper happily trotting beside her, stopping every few minutes so he could investigate something interesting along the sidewalk. Nobody in town talked much about the delegation anymore. They had visitors, they answered questions, and then they returned to ordinary life. One warm evening, Mason sat on Daniel's front porch watching the sun disappear behind the Montana mountains. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass, and crickets had begun their nightly chorus. Daniel handed him a mug of coffee. "Think they finally understand us?" Mason smiled into the fading light. "Some of them do." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "What about the rest?" Mason watched Lily laughing as Cooper chased fireflies across the yard. "The rest will learn the same way everyone else does." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "How is that?" Mason answered quietly. "By meeting good people before they meet hard times." Neither man spoke again for several minutes. They did not need to. Across the yard, Lily finally caught one tiny firefly in her hands. She looked at it for a second, smiled, and gently opened her fingers so it could fly back into the night. Mason watched the little light disappear into the darkness before saying one last thing. "That is humanity." Daniel followed the glowing insect until it vanished among hundreds of others. Letting it go, Mason slowly shook his head, knowing that you could hold on, and choosing not to. Years later, historians would remember the Council's corrected report as an important scientific milestone. But the people who had actually been there remembered something else. They remembered that the greatest misunderstanding had never been about human teeth, human hands, or even human evolution. It had been about the quiet choices made every ordinary day by ordinary people who understood that real strength is measured not by what you are capable of doing, but by what you decide the world will never have to fear from you.